All the people who are in the hells are devoted to evil goals and the distortions that result. There is no one there devoted to evil goals and also interested in true perceptions. Many evil people in the world know about spiritual truths, the truths of the church, since they have learned them first in childhood and later from sermons and from reading the word, and have gone on to take them for granted in their conversations. Some of them have even led others to believe that they were Christians at heart, because they had learned from these truths how to talk with apparent affection and to behave honestly as though motivated by a spiritual faith. As for the ones who inwardly thought the opposite, though, and who carefully refrained from doing the evil things they were thinking of, simply because of civil laws and for the sake of their reputation and rank and profit, they are all evil at heart, involved in what is true and good only physically, not in spirit. So when their outer layers are stripped off in the other life, and the inner natures that constituted their spirits are unveiled, they are wholly absorbed in evil and false concerns, unconcerned with anything true and good. Then one can see that the true and good values simply dwelt in their memories as things they had learned about, and that they retrieved them from memory when they were talking and imitated good deeds as though they were motivated by a spiritual love and faith. When people like this are let into their inner natures, into their evils that is, they can no longer say anything true. They can only say what is false because their speech arises from their evil intentions. It is impossible to say anything true for evil ends, because by then their spirits are made up of nothing but their own evil, and falsity emanates from evil. Every evil spirit is distilled to this state before he or she is thrown into hell. This is called being stripped down as to what is true and good. The stripping down is simply the process of being let into their own inner natures, into what they have claimed as spirits then, or into their spirits themselves. When we are like this after death, then we are no longer spirit people the way we were in the first state. We are truly spirits, since people who are truly spirits have faces and bodies responsive to the inner natures of their minds, so they are in an outward form that is the imprint or image of their inner natures. Spirits are like this once the first and second states described above have been completed. This means that when they are seen by spiritual eyes, one can tell instantly what their nature is, not only from their faces, but also from their bodies, and especially from their speech and behavior. Further, because they are now their essential selves, they can only be where kindred souls are. There is a complete sharing of affections and consequent thoughts in the spiritual world. So spirits move spontaneously toward kindred spirits because they are motivated by what attracts and delights them. In fact, they actually turn in that direction, because that is how they breathe in their life, or draw their breath freely, and not when they turn elsewhere. We need to realize that in the spiritual world, communication depends on which way we face, and that the people in front of us are always the ones who are in a love like our own. This applies no matter which way we turn our bodies. This is why hellish spirits all turn away from the Lord toward the gloomy and dark objects there that are in the location of earth, sun, and moon, while heaven's angels all turn toward the Lord as the sun and the moon of heaven. This leads us to the conclusion that all the people in the hells are absorbed in evils and consequent falsities, and also that they turn toward their loves. The appearance and behavior of hellish spirits, well, it's quite telling. Their faces and bodies reflect their inner natures, showing the true essence of their spirits. Their speech and actions are clear indicators of their evil intentions, and they can only associate with souls that share their malevolent traits. It's a stark contrast to the heavenly spirits whose outward forms are a manifestation of their pure, good-hearted nature. In the end, hellish spirits reveal their true selves, unable to hide behind facades any longer. Seen in any of heaven's light, All the spirits in the hells appear in the form of their own evil. Each one is in fact an image of her or his evil, since for each individual the inner and outer natures are acting as a unit, and the deeper elements present themselves to view in the outer ones, in the face, the body, the speech, and the behavior, so you can tell what they are like by looking at them. In general, they are forms of contempt for others, threats against people who do not revere them. They are forms of various shadings of hatred, of various forms of vengefulness. Savagery and cruelty show through from within. When others praise them, though, or revere and worship them, their faces compose themselves and look almost happy and gratified. There is no way to describe briefly all the ways these forms look, since no one is just like any other. There is only a general likeness among people who are absorbed in similar evils and are therefore in the same hellish community. A similarity that acts like a common background that gives the individual faces a kind of overall resemblance. In general, their faces are frightful, as lifeless as corpses. Some of their faces are black, some like little torches, some pimply, with huge ulcerated sores. In many cases, there is no visible face, only something hairy or bony in its place, while with others only the teeth show. Their bodies are equally misshapen, and their speech seems to embody wrath or hatred, since all their articulation comes from their false perception, and all the tone comes from their evil intent. In a word, they are all images of their hell. I have not been allowed to see what form hell itself is in overall. I have only been told that in the same way that all heaven as a single entity resembles a single human being, so all hell as a single entity resembles a single devil and can be manifested as a likeness of a single devil. However, I have often seen what form particular hells or hellish communities have, since at their entrances, which are called the gates of hell, there often appears a monstrous figure that in a general way represents the form of the people who live there. The savagery of these inhabitants is then represented by frightful horrors that I forbear to mention. Perception and reality in hell. Well, they are deeply intertwined. The way spirits perceive themselves and each other is a far cry from their true nature. This perception is distorted, creating a false sense of reality among the inhabitants. Yet this illusion is a kind of mercy, sparing them from the full horror of their own appearances. It does need to be known, though, that hellish spirits look like this in heaven's light, but that they look human to each other. This is a gift of the Lord's mercy, so that they do not look as repulsive to each other as they do to angels. However, this appearance is deceiving, since the moment a ray of light from heaven is let in, these human forms turn into the monstrous ones that they are essentially, the forms just described, because in heaven's light everything appears as it really is. This is also why they avoid heaven's light and dive into their own illumination, an illumination like that of glowing coals, or, in places, like burning sulfur. This light, though, turns into pure darkness when any ray of light from heaven flows in. This is why the hells are described as being in gloom and darkness, and why the gloom and darkness mean the kinds of malevolent distortions characteristic of hell. Having examined the misshapen forms of spirits in the hells, forms that, as noted, are all forms of contempt for others, of threats against people who do not respect and revere them, and of hatred and vengeance against people who do not support them, it has become clear to me that in general they are all forms of love for oneself and the world, and that the evils that give rise to individual forms can all be traced back to these two loves. I have also been told from heaven, and it has been witnessed to me by an abundance of experience, that these two loves, love for oneself and love of the world, do rule in the hells and actually constitute the hells, and that love for the Lord and love for one's neighbor rule in the heavens and actually constitute the heavens. I have also learned that the two loves that are hell's loves and the two loves that are heaven's loves are absolute opposites. At first, I wondered why love for oneself and love of the world are so diabolic, why people who are absorbed in them look so frightful. After all, in the world, we scarcely give love for ourselves a second thought. We focus only on that outward inflation of spirit called pride, which we believe is the only self-love because it is so visible. Not only that, if love for oneself does not express itself in pride, then we in the world think it is the vital fire that rouses us to work for high position and to do constructive things. We believe that if we saw no prospect of esteem and glory in these efforts, our spirits would become sluggish. People ask, who would do anything decent or useful or remarkable except to be praised and respected by others, openly or in their thoughts? And where does this come from, except from the fire of a love for glory and esteem? That is, for the sake of self. This is why people in the world do not realize that in its own right, love for oneself is the love that rules in hell, and that makes hell within us. Since this is in fact the case, I should like first to describe what love for oneself is, and then explain that everything evil and false wells up from this love. Love for oneself is intending well to oneself alone, not to others except for the sake of oneself, not the church, the country, or any human community. It is helping them solely for the sake of one's own reputation and rank and glory. Unless these can be seen in the services we offer, we are saying at heart, what difference does it make? Why should I? What's in it for me? So we forget it. We can see from this that people who are absorbed in a love for themselves do not love their church or country or community or any constructive activity. They love only themselves. Their only pleasure lies in self-gratification, and since the pleasure that stems from love constitutes human life, their life is a life of self. A life of self is a life that depends on what we claim as our own, and in its own right, what we claim as our own is nothing but evil. People who love themselves do love their own as well, their own being specifically their children and grandchildren, and more broadly all who ally with them, whom they call their own people. Loving both the former and the latter is actually loving themselves, because they regard the others as though they were in themselves, and focus on themselves in others. These others, who are claimed as their own, include everyone who praises and reveres and worships them. We can gather what love for oneself is like by comparing it to heavenly love. Heavenly love is loving constructive activity for its own sake, or loving for their own sake the worthwhile things we do for our church, our country, the human community, and our fellow citizens. This is really loving God and loving our neighbor, since all constructive activities and all worthwhile actions come from God and are the neighbor whom we are to love. In contrast, people who love these activities for the sake of self-love them only as slaves who wait on them. It follows that people devoted to a love for themselves want their church, their country, the human community, and their fellow citizens to be their servants rather than wanting to serve them. They station themselves above these neighbors and put them down. So to the extent that people are devoted to a love for themselves, they move themselves away from heaven because they move themselves away from heavenly love. Further, to the extent that we are engaged in heavenly love, which is loving constructive and worthwhile activities and being moved by heartfelt pleasure when we provide them to our church, our country, the human community, and our fellow citizens. We are being led by the Lord because this is the love He is in and the love that comes from Him. However, to the extent that we focus on love for ourselves, doing constructive and worthwhile things for our own sakes, we are leading ourselves. And to the extent that we lead ourselves, we are not being led by the Lord. Again, then, it follows that the more we love ourselves, the more we move away from the divine and also from heaven. Being led by self is being led by what we claim as our own, and what we claim as our own is nothing but evil. It is actually our evil heredity, which involves loving ourselves more than God and the world more than heaven. We are completely absorbed in our self-image, and therefore in our hereditary evil, whenever we focus on ourselves in anything worthwhile we are doing, for we are focusing on ourselves and away from what is good, and not on what is good, and away from ourselves. So in the worthwhile activities, we set up an image of ourselves, and not an image of the divine. I have been assured of this by experience as well. There are evil spirits who live halfway between the north and the west, underneath the heavens, who are particularly skilled at getting upright spirits involved in their self-image, and therefore focused on various kinds of evil. They do this by getting them absorbed in thinking about themselves, either openly by words of praise and esteem, or covertly by focusing their feelings exclusively on themselves. To the extent that they succeed, they turn the faces of the upright people away from heaven, and also becloud their understanding, calling up evils from their self-concern. If you look at their origins and essences, you can see that love for oneself and love of one's neighbor are opposites. In people who are wrapped up in love for themselves, love of their neighbor begins from self. They claim that everyone is his or her own neighbor. And from this as a center, they reach out to all who ally with them, with progressively less intensity, depending on the love that unites the others with them. They regard people outside this group as worthless, and people who offer opposition to them and their evil-doing they regard as enemies. It does not matter what they are actually like, whether they are wise or upright or honest or fair. A spiritual love of their neighbor, though, begins with the Lord and spreads out from him as its center to all who are united to him by love and faith. Its spread depends on the quality of their love and faith. We can see from this that a love of our neighbor that begins with ourselves is the opposite of a love of our neighbor that begins with the Lord. The former comes from evil because it comes from what we claim as our own, while the latter comes from what is good because it comes from the Lord, who is good itself. We can also see that a love of our neighbor that comes from us and from our self-image is a physical love, while a love of our neighbor that comes from the Lord is heavenly. In a word, when we are absorbed in love for ourselves, it constitutes our head, and heavenly love constitutes the feet we stand on. If heavenly love does not serve us, we trample it underfoot. This is why people who are being thrown into hell look as though they are diving in head first, with their heads down and their feet toward heaven. By nature, self-love runs wild to the extent that its reins are loosened, that is, to the extent that the outward restraints constituted by fears of the law and its penalties, fears of losing reputation, esteem, profit, position, and life are taken away. It runs wild even to the extent of wanting to rule not only over the whole globe, but even over all heaven and the Lord himself. It knows no bound or limit. This is latent in everyone who is focused on self-love, even though it may not show in the world, where the restraints we have mentioned hold it back. Self-love in power. We cannot fail to see this in people in power and kings who are not held back by any such restraints. They run wild and conquer as many territories and kingdoms as they can, and aspire to boundless power and glory. This is even clearer in the modern Babylon, which extends its control into heaven and transfers all the Lord's divine power to itself, and even craves more. The reader may see in the booklet, The Last Judgment and Babylon Destroyed, that people like this are diametrically opposed to the divine and to heaven, and that they favor hell when they arrive in the other life after death. Picture a community made up of people like this, all totally in love with themselves, not caring about others unless they are allies, and you will see that their love is no different from that of thieves for each other. To the extent that they are acting in concert, They embrace each other and call each other friends. But once they stop cooperating, once anyone resists their control, they attack and butcher each other. If their deeper natures, their minds, are probed, it will be clear that they are full of virulent hatred for each other, that at heart they ridicule anything fair and honest, and even ridicule the deity, tossing it aside as worthless. This comes out even more clearly from their communities in the hells, which will be described below. The deeper levels of the thoughts and affections of people who love themselves above all are turned toward themselves and the world, and are turned away therefore from the Lord and heaven. This is why such people fall prey to all kinds of evil, and why the divine nature cannot flow in. It is because the moment it does flow in, it is submerged in thoughts about self and polluted, and is saturated with evils that arise from their self-centeredness. This is why they all look away from the Lord in the other life, toward the gloom that occupies the sight of our world's sun there, and is directly across from heaven's sun, which is the Lord. Darkness means evil, and our world's sun means self-love. In broad terms, the evils characteristic of people focused on love for themselves are contempt for others, envy, enmity toward anyone who is not on their side, and a consequent hostility, various kinds of hatred, vengefulness, craft, deceit, callousness, and cruelty. In religious matters, this extends not only to a contempt for the divine and for the divine gifts that are the true and good elements of the Church, it extends also to anger at such things, an anger that turns into hatred when we become spirits. Then, not only can we not stand hearing about these matters, we blaze with hatred against everyone who acknowledges and worships the divine. I talked with one man who had been in power in the world and loved himself far too much. When he simply heard the divine mentioned, especially when he heard the Lord named, he was so struck by angry hatred that he was consumed with thoughts of murder. When the reins of his love were loosened, he even wanted to be the devil himself in order to satisfy his love by ceaseless attacks on heaven. Many individuals of the papal religion feel this desire in the other life when they realize that the Lord has all power and that they have none. Some spirits appeared to me in the western region toward the south who said they had been granted high honor in the world and deserved to be promoted over others and to lord it over them. They were examined by angels to discover what they were like inwardly, and it turned out that in their earthly offices they had paid no attention to service but only to themselves, which meant that they had put themselves before service. Still, since they were aflame with ambition to be promoted, they were allowed to join a group of people who were discussing some rather important matters. You could tell, though, that they were unable to pay any attention to the real issues that were being discussed, and could not see the matters in any depth. They did not say anything on the basis of the constructive effects of the discussion, but talked only on the basis of their own self-image. Their behavior was motivated by a desire to ingratiate themselves, so they were dismissed from the task and left to seek office elsewhere. So they went farther westward, where they were accepted here and there, but in every case they were told that they were not thinking about anything but themselves, that they were not thinking about the business at hand except in terms of themselves. This indicated that they were ignorant, much like sensual and materialistic spirits. Wherever they arrived then, they were rejected. After a while, they were utterly bankrupt and were asking for handouts. Power and love are deeply intertwined, shaping the essence of our actions and intentions. Once more, I could see from this that no matter how wisely people may seem to talk in the world from the fire of self-love, still it is just a matter of rote memory and not of any rational light. So in the other life, when they are no longer allowed to retrieve things from their natural memory, they are more ignorant than other people because they are cut off from the divine. There are two ways of being in power. One comes from love for our neighbor, and the other from love for ourselves. In essence, these two kinds of power are exact opposites. People who are empowered by love for their neighbor intend the good of everyone and love nothing more than being useful, that is, serving others. Serving others means willing well and helping others, whether that is one's church, country, community, or fellow citizen. This is their love and the delight of their hearts. As such people are raised to high positions, they are delighted. But the delight is not because of the honor, but because of the constructive things they can now do more abundantly and at a higher level. This is what empowerment is like in the heavens. In contrast, people whose self-love leads them to take power intend good to no one but themselves. Any services they perform for others are actually for their own esteem and renown, since only this is of any use to them. Helping others is for them simply a means to being waited on and respected and deferred to. They strive for high office, not for the good they ought to do for their country and their church, but to be prominent and praised, and therefore in their heart's delight. A love of power does stay with all of us after death. However, people whose authority rested on their love for their neighbor are entrusted with power in the heavens. Actually, it is not they who have power, but the services that they love. And when service rules, the Lord is ruling. However, people whose authority rested on their self-love in the world arrive in hell after their life in this world and are miserable slaves there. I have seen powerful people whose authority had rested on their self-love in the world abandoned among the most miserable, some of them living in outhouses. As for love of the world, it is not so intensely opposed to heavenly love, because there are not so many evils latent in it. Love of the world is wanting to divert the wealth of others to ourselves by any means available. It is setting our heart on wealth and allowing the world to distract us from the spiritual love that is love for our neighbor, and therefore from heaven and the divine. This love takes many forms, though. We may love wealth in order to be raised to exalted rank simply because we love exalted rank. We may love exalted rank and high position for the sake of wealth. We may love wealth for the sake of the various pleasures it offers in the world. We may love wealth simply for the sake of wealth, which is avarice, and so on. The purpose of being wealthy is called its use, and purpose or use is what gives a love its quality. That is, the quality of a love is determined by the goal it aims at. Everything else serves it as means.